One of the interesting things in designing a program is what to do after food coma kicks in, and what to do before drinks that people will be interested in. Very fortunately, we are blessed to have First Nations investment framework presented by New South Wales Treasury. I'm sure it's what a lot of people will be interested in. It's not yet public, but it's on its way. You are getting a sneak preview of all the really good bits of it. I'm delighted to have Shaun and Laura presenting, after which there'll be a short break when we'll do a little bit of rearrangement to get the panel up, and but we'll keep you entertained for that bit. But I'm delighted to introduce the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Alrighty. Thanks, everyone. As Robert said, my name is Shaun. I'm joined by Laura, and we're from New South Wales Treasury. It is the graveyard slot, I know, but hopefully everyone's caffeinated and hanging on until drinks, which Robert's really keen about too. So I just want to thank as well the Economic Society for having us here on Gadigal Country today. I've got the easy job, which is to just introduce the topic, and then I hand over to Laura and she does the hard work. But I wanted to just share some of my personal reflections, having been in Treasury for 4 years now, and this particular project's been sort of the main piece of work for me. So I'll do that. I'll also introduce what we're going to be covering, which you can see on the board there. We're really talking here about a new Treasury policy and guideline called the First Nations Investment Framework. I'll also be talking about some of the research that our team has undertaken, and particularly on guidance for cost-benefit analysis. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. So a bit about us. You'll see on this little chart here where we fit into Treasury. So we are in the Economic Strategy and Productivity group, and within the Centre for Economic Evidence. The work we do really cuts across the 4 teams you see at the bottom there. So we do provide advisory work. We also provide advice on evaluation. We also feed in to the performance and wellbeing framework as well. And our mission is really about supporting the New South Wales government's core business practices and ways of working to integrate First Nations values, perspectives, and aspirations, which is pretty lofty. And to make that happen, it's really about the evidence base and lifting that evidence base so then we can identify and prioritise the things that work. In those 4 years, I guess, of being in Treasury, I came into Treasury from working at a local government level and in the NGO world, where social return on investment was the thing that everyone spoke about. And then you come into Treasury and everything's cost-benefit analysis, and that's fine. But I think one of the things we need to remember in the room here is that it's almost a language in its own right, and it's got its own rules. And for those who are trying to play that game, it's quite the learning curve. In New South Wales, we have an overarching policy under Closing the Gap. We've signed up to this through a national agreement where the Commonwealth governments recognised that state governments and local governments hold some of the policy levers, and that's fine as well. However, there's this clause in there, Clause 55 and Clause 113, which basically says all Aboriginal programs should be evaluated, and where possible, funding should be reprioritised to Aboriginal-led, Aboriginal-designed services. So in a way, we're kind of passing a burden, as we in the government, is we strive for improvements in evidence and the evidence base where we're drawing on to make decisions. But we're going to be shifting that burden to the community sector as well, to make that case that new services or the reprioritisation of funding flows to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So it's really important for us that we're not just adding to that burden. And so the First Nations Investment Framework provides some of that guidance for good practice around policy design, implementation, and evaluation. Some of the work, and this is publicly available, so along with the soon-to-be-released investment framework, we've got some publications on our website, including research into the business sector, women's economic participation, and data reform. And here just shows you a bit of a map. On the left, you've got where this new TPG fits into the broader suite of TPGs. And so you'll see there that the investment framework, which with that little arrow pointing to the right, shows you that it's really providing that good practice guidance for the whole policy cycle. So we're not just focused on cost-benefit analysis. We're not just focused on evaluation. We're covering the whole policy cycle. The foundations of the framework, and a lot in the room their eyes will jump to the bottom there and see, oh, there's a CBA appendix item. Does it provide me with a benefits menu that I can just jump to? The bad news for you is that you do have to do some of the earlier work, and it's set up in a way to provide you with that foundation for A, building genuine relationships, B, moving towards a state where we've got shared decision-making, and then we're factoring in things like community-led design, data collection that adheres to things like data sovereignty and governance. And we've got that transparency and accountability in terms of sharing information back with communities as well. So if we don't get those fundamentals right, we can't jump ahead to CBA and start exploring our options. For this one as well, we undertook back in 2022 a really comprehensive listening series on evaluation practice. We spoke to people across the sector as well as in the community-controlled sector to try and find out what's the current baseline for evaluation practice, where are the challenges, where are the opportunities, where can we do things better? And we've published the findings of that. We also published in March this year a research paper on cost-benefit analysis practice. So here we looked at some case studies of CBA where it's been done well, where culture has been incorporated into the CBA. And we've been able to then take that research and create an economic framework of culture, which Laura will speak to shortly. And I think, look, from all of the research we did, and for me, speaking as a proud Garigal descendant as well, but this first quote at the top is really important, and that really came through with all of the case studies and all of our research, which is that culture is a concept that's difficult to articulate because it is, as the women on Murray Island said, it's everything. So just caveating that the research and the TPG, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't provide a solution for everything, and it doesn't really provide you a shortcut from having those really important conversations with the stakeholders that are most important for a particular policy or program. I'll hand over to Laura now.
Thanks, Shaun. So one of the areas that we explored in our research was the growing evidence on the impact of First Nations cultures in delivering broader outcomes. And this slide shows two extracts from projects that were taken in parallel by the Lowitja Institute and the ANU that explore those links between culture and health and wellbeing outcomes. And obviously, as Shaun's mentioned, there's many different elements that make up First Nations cultures, and these are diverse and they're evolving. And they mean different things in different communities. And so this table on the left is, I guess, a simplification of that, illustrating from a review that was done, how has the literature conceptualized what makes up culture for the purpose of exploring the influence of culture on health and wellbeing. And as we can see, there's quite a range of different components to that. The chart on the right is from a literature review that was done in parallel that found that the number of publications in this area has been growing since the mid-2000s, largely driven by international research. And of the 72 studies that this paper reviewed, the majority, around 85%, found a positive relationship between First Nations cultures and health and wellbeing outcomes, with another 12% reporting a mix of positive and non-significant associations. This review found that there's significant opportunity to lift the quality of this evidence and gain a deeper understanding of these causal relationships. And in particular, it's informed the development of a national longitudinal study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander wellbeing, known as the Mai-Kauai study, which I'll talk to again a little bit later. But just to put it into some more tangible terms, just want to talk through some examples. We cover a range in the CBA research paper, but here I'll focus on education and health. So on the left here, we've got a chart that presents student survey data that was analysed by the New South Wales Government Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation, or CC. And this shows that students who feel good about their culture when they're at school and that report that their teachers have a good understanding of their culture are more likely to aspire to go to university. And so while this data only presents a correlation, the notion of the role of culture in supporting educational engagement is supported as well in other work. For example, there was some analysis of 2013 data from the Footprints in Time, which is the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, which found that First Nations primary school students achieved higher literacy, maths and vocabulary scores if their school incorporated First Nations histories and cultures across all subjects as a cross-curriculum priority. And those results were statistically significant after controlling for other factors that affect student performance, such as attendance, health, year level, parental education, and remoteness. On the right, I've just got an extract from a publication in the Lancet journal, which then goes and takes the next step. So not only identifying that link between culture and broader outcomes, but quantifying how large that outcome could be. And this was a 5-year study looking at the impact of the Birthing in Our Community service, which was established also in 2013 as a partnership between the local First Nations Community Controlled Health Service in Brisbane, the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health, and the Mater Mothers Hospital. This service is an integrated and culturally informed model of maternity care that gives women access to a primary midwife throughout their pregnancy, birth, and the postnatal period. And they get access to that midwife through a culturally safe, community-controlled hub, managed by the health service, which is supported by a First Nations workforce strategy. And they've also got family support workers on site that facilitate access to other broader wraparound services, and a transport officer as well to help facilitate access to appointments. And so this 5-year study of the program found that First Nations babies born in the program were 50% less likely to be born premature compared to standard care, and delivering estimated cost savings of just under $5,000 per mother-baby pair after accounting for differences in patient characteristics. And so they estimated in that study that replicating that model nationally, noting that you want to have slightly different delivery models in different locations, could potentially prevent almost 1,000 preterm births each year, with annual cost savings of around $86 million. So then we moved on to looking at the CBAs and how this kind of evidence has been embedded so far. First, we found that there aren't really that many CBAs of First Nations targeted initiatives at the moment, or so far, and that's likely due to a range of different reasons. But focusing on the CBAs that are available, some have picked up this concept that culture can be an input through the program logic, improving the effect size of initiative. But this isn't always explicitly drawn out or articulated relative to other options, so the contribution of culture can be hard to see. Instead, what we've seen more often is that First Nations culture is described or treated in terms of other distinct benefits and outcomes, or outcomes and benefits that flow from that. And this is probably more intuitive to a lot of us. So, thinking about outcomes like connection to culture, connection to country, self-determination, those are often listed in the lists of benefits associated with programs. And it's recognising the intrinsic value of First Nations cultures in their own right. So, there's value for First Nations people and communities in strengthening their cultural practice and their lived experience of culture. There's also value that enriches the broader Australian community. And so while that's might be easier to conceptualise, culture as an outcome in its own right, it's CBAs have tended to discuss those outcomes qualitatively, and because the pool of quantitative estimates is very, very limited. So, we've got non-market techniques, valuation techniques that we can apply to try and capture some of the values associated with cultural outcomes, but they haven't really been applied much in Australia at all. And part of that is that those techniques are hard to do right in the first place, but then you've got cultural sensitivities to manage on top of that. And also, because of that limited pool of estimates, what we found is that there's a higher risk that existing parameters, if used in benefit transfer, can be used out of context, which can also be problematic if there hasn't been proper engagement with communities in the development of the initiative. So with these findings in mind, we identified 3 opportunities for improving current practice. Here they are. The first is the importance of genuine partnership with First Nations people and communities from the early stages of CBA. So we're not just talking about including culture at the evaluation step here, but right from the first stages of understanding the case for change and scoping out culturally informed options to achieve the outcomes for community. So this is necessary to be able to make the case that cultural outcomes will be achieved from a program, or that culture will improve the effectiveness of the initiative by being embedded in its design and delivery. Like, you just can't reasonably make the case that that's going to happen if you haven't engaged properly with community from the early stages. We also found that there's a need for specific methodological guidance on how to effectively capture and incorporate First Nation culture in CBA. So we've tried to address this information gap through the investment framework. And finally, we emphasise that there needs to be continued investment in research, outcome evaluations and ex post CBAs to continue to strengthen this evidence base, understand what works and in what contexts, and to inform future policy and program design and lift CBA evidence base. So part of this further research will involve understanding the causal pathways a bit better, through which culture can improve other outcomes. And so what I've got on the right here is an excerpt from the Mayukwayus survey, which I just mentioned earlier. This is a longitudinal survey. It's a really great example of First Nations-led research that demonstrates good practice in terms of survey design, coming up with really valid measures of what does culture mean, and then how does that link to measures of health and wellbeing. And also it demonstrates really strong Indigenous data sovereignty and governance in how data is analysed and decisions are made about how that's shared. So if you are doing work that involves understanding the influence of First Nations cultures on health and wellbeing, I really would encourage you to check that out and consider making an application for data analysis to inform your work. But yeah, just shifting back to what we've done now in the investment framework is that, as Shaun's mentioned, we've developed an economic framework of culture. And this is about encouraging us to recognise and think through that for the purpose of policy design, evaluation and economic appraisal, that First Nations cultures can be considered an asset or an institution that can be both an input to and outcome of initiatives. So by embedding culture in an initiative, not only can we achieve important cultural outcomes, but also culture can lift the effectiveness and increase the range or the magnitude of the outcomes that are achieved by that program or project. And this is obviously an interdependent relationship, right? Because as we embed culture in the delivery of an initiative, it then, I guess, so to speak, can strengthen and build on the capital stock of culture as well. So in terms of putting this into practice, we're encouraging agencies and others involved in CBAs to work through 3 steps when developing options and identifying benefits. The first is thinking about culture as an input and what culturally informed options might look like. The second is identifying and describing the ways in which culture can improve effectiveness. So for this step, refer you to the middle part of this slide. We've identified 5 different effects of culture, and these draw on learnings from our engagement process and also elements of institutional economic theory, such as Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework. So this framework recognises the significance of institutions in governing common pool resources by doing things like facilitating cooperation, sharing information, and solving collective action problems. So these different effects or pathways aren't intended as an exhaustive list, and there also will be overlap at times between the role that they play as culture drives improvements in other outcomes. But we've presented them as options for us all to think through when looking to kind of understand and explain the contribution of culture in how a program is delivered. And so this can then support the final step, which is to identify the outcomes that are expected to be achieved as a result of those different effects, and then continue the steps of CBA in terms of estimating and valuing those impacts and benefits. So as Shaun mentioned, this is a methodology-based framework. The TPG doesn't prescribe a monetary value of culture or give cultural benefit parameters, but instead it's an approach that's designed to support the development of culturally informed options with First Nations stakeholders and consider the full range of outcomes that culture can help to support and achieve for First Nations people and communities. So what do we mean by like culturally informed options? That could include things like delivery by an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. It could be an option that applies a place-based lens that responds to local strategic priorities and circumstances. It could be an option that supports access to land, water, or cultural heritage. It could be an option that centres and incorporates First Nations cultural practices, or that applies a trauma-informed delivery model, recognising historic and systemic barriers and inequities. So what we've got as well in the framework to help kind of explain how to put this into practice is a worked example. This is about land management. It's a hypothetical example. Let me get it on the slide for you. There we go. And so while this one's hypothetical, we've chosen it because there is an emerging evidence base in this area that demonstrates how First Nations involvement in land management can not only build connection to culture and country, but also support improved environmental outcomes through the application of cultural knowledge and values. So there's emerging research on this around threatened species preservation and bushfire risk reduction through cultural burning. And also, not only that it can also support a range of other broader benefits for First Nations people and communities involved in the work, including labour surplus benefits, health benefits, and avoided costs for government, for example, through reduced contact with the justice system. So this example considers two options. First, investment in First Nations community-controlled organisations to run land management projects directly. And second, creating new First Nations identified positions within government land management agencies. And so what we do is talk through, or write through when you read it, how the outcomes and benefits between these two options can vary, and link that back to the contribution of culture through the different effects in the framework. So just as an example, we talk about how option one's got greater scope for supporting application and sharing of cultural knowledge relative to option two, as there's greater community involvement and decision-making on how the cultural knowledge is applied. And that's also enhanced by the increased matching, or higher likelihood of more direct matching of community members to land management opportunities on their own country. So it's the specific local knowledge that's being applied to the specific environment of that area. Through that will be enhanced compared to just offering positions under option two. And so all of these, through these different effects, it can support higher options under option one compared to option two, not only greater environmental outcomes, but also things like strengthened cultural identity and social capital. And option one's also got more potential for broader community engagement with cultural land management practices, which could include, for example, involving First Nations youth, which can then drive broader outcomes down the line. So when working through this, we want people to be drawing on the evidence that's available to make the case about the role of culture, whether that's previous evaluations, but it might also include talking with community members, getting feedback on the situation in the community and how they see culture playing a role, and then obviously backing that up through development of like a monitoring and evaluation program as the program is implemented to continue to build up the evidence base. But yeah, it will look different in different places. So one other thing from this example is that it recognises that culturally informed initiatives often require time for community engagement, knowledge transfer and capacity building. So potentially in some cases, the benefits may take longer to realise under a situation like option 1 compared to option 2, but be greater over the medium to long term due to the deeper integration of cultural practices and better community involvement and empowerment. I'll just finish now with a summary. Really just wanted to reiterate that it's the whole First Nations investment framework that's relevant to CBA. So encourage everyone to read through it in full and not just focus on the appendix, as Shaun mentioned. For example, the economic framework of culture that I spoke to, that's covered in chapter 4, so the main body of the framework. And we've explained that as well in terms of logic models, which is a really helpful piece of work that can be taken alongside CBA to help map out how different outcomes link to different benefits before we move on to valuation. And just wanted to emphasize that a partnership approach to scoping options is really key, and that there are important foundations that we need to be having in place ourselves as government agencies and others involved in CBAs to be well placed to form the trusted relationships that we need with First Nations stakeholders when doing this work together effectively. And that's it. So happy to take any questions or comments.
Look, thank you very much. Like I said, it's hard to do that graveyard shift, but stand up, you can sit down. Sorry. It's very hard, but after a presentation on something like transport, which is a very well established, gone through, in my case, often quite boring presentation, to see something like this, which is sort of very new, very cutting edge, very dynamic and very difficult, is just wonderful. I'm sure we have questions from the audience. Is there any particular one over in the corner? And we'll wait for the microphone so people can hear online. So.
Thank you. Hi, Laura. Thank you for a great presentation. And I really love that you brought up the work that the Mayukuayu group are doing, because it's really rigorous. Mm-hmm. I guess my question is, so it's based on my own experience. So working at Boxar, we work really closely with our Aboriginal Services Unit, and they have a randomized control trial. They let us run one in district court. So they're really good. But I also have colleagues in other parts of government working in the Aboriginal evaluation teams. And lately, one of the things we've been doing is kind of sharing what we've learned about some of the evaluation practice from I would say the organizations that you might contract with. And one of these organizations, someone did try to share with them the results of that Mayukuayu study on culture and say, look, here's a potential measure. And they actually completely rejected it, right? And so I guess, I think my question is, are you guys conscious of the possibility that evaluation in this space could go a very similar way to how it's gone more generally, where you've got a lot of firms who are not really engaging with that rigorous practice. And so it kind of creates the same situation where you might want to encourage more CBA, but what you get is just a lot of, I guess, not very rigorous qualitative evaluation, which is needed, but just not really helping this cause. I mean, so is there ways of, this is the first time I've seen anyone else in government reference that Mayukuayu study. What could we be doing to actually encourage that a bit more?
Yeah, I guess like different parts of government and also different parts of the community will be at different stages in either working together or working on evaluations. And I think hopefully having the framework out in public very soon will maybe provide a bit of like guidance from the centre of government that's saying this is the kind of, we want strong evidence coming through the budget process, and help to facilitate those conversations around, what's needed. And it will be a mix of quantitative and qualitative work, I still think. But yeah, what our team is trying to push is for development and use of robust evidence.
Yeah, because I think like there are a lot of people out there who are in that position where they have to commission evaluation and cost benefit, and especially when you know, the programs affect a lot of First Nations people. But I would say that it's sometimes the commissioners as well are not so clear what they should be doing and looking for and what the options are. And so I think stuff like MyKawaii just helps kind of tell people like what could be done.
Yeah.
So yeah, anything you guys can do, I think would be great. Thanks.
Any questions online? Okay, we might take a question online because the room is suffering from rogophobia at the moment. The lady is. So.
So a question online, are the documents and frameworks developed by Treasury for projects that are mainly for Aboriginal people, or what documents can you recommend for projects that have other main focuses for which there may be Aboriginal impacts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, the First Nations investment framework is not just for First Nations targeted initiatives. We really want people to be thinking through the impacts on First Nations communities for all initiatives, and then moving from there in terms of when a partnership approach is appropriate on a specific aspect. We have got some sort of examples in the TPG about what those types of more mainstream initiatives that where this could be really relevant might look like. So things about any kind of initiative that's looking to drive a change in an outcome that links to one of the closing the gap targets or priorities, that where First Nations people are a key cohort within the group that's being impacted by the service or the program, or for example, an infrastructure project that's being delivered in an area with a high First Nations population. Like, obviously important opportunities to be working together there on those type of projects as well. So yeah, definitely don't want this to be restricted to just targeted work.
Corey has a question.
Yeah. Really great work, guys. And there's been a lot of us, myself included, who've been really looking forward to this being released. So happy, feel very grateful that we got to get some early insight into what it's going to look like. So I think one of the challenges that we're all going to have is like applying this in practice. So I'm just wondering if you've spoken at all about releasing or speaking to agencies who are applying this and getting case studies together and making them public.
Yeah, so we've been very busy and focused on design the last week or so of the actual document, but also we've been planning what next. So this is similar to the sort of updates to the business case guidelines and things that Michael alluded to. As this goes out, we're going to be like running different sort of face-to-face opportunities with agencies, and we really also want to build up a bit of a case study bank to be sharing sort of what works well. Because yeah, as I said, the experience is mixed. Like, there are some really great things going on where the capability is really strong, working with First Nations communities, and others where it isn't so great. So we want to share those really good examples of work that's been done.
Well, we're running a little bit short on time. Sarah definitely can't have a question because she's talking next.
We can talk.
So that was a very nice lead into the transparency and openness and examples that we'll be doing in the panel.
I have a very quick question. So I mean, data set in CBA is always a problem. So in case indigenous population, you don't have a data set, so you have three options. You don't do it. You wait for until the data available. Second option is you borrow from non-indigenous population. And the third option is you borrow from First Nation from another country. So what's the advice on that? Like, what option you think would be the best when the data for indigenous people not available?
Yeah, I don't think there's probably a single answer. Like, obviously we all are encountering data challenges for different things that we're working on day to day. I think we'd say definitely prioritize talking to the local community to kind of get an understanding of the situation there, and I guess, yeah, what that looks like and what their priorities are and the circumstances. And then I guess then you've got to, I guess, make a call, right, on terms of what's going to be your best way forward in terms of trying to capture what that looks like and how a project might change things. So yeah, I guess it depends on the relevance of the other data that's available, or whether that's internationally or just relating to the mainstream population. It's hard, it's not easy, but yeah. But also, I guess we should use that too as an opportunity to be thinking about where can we improve the data that's collected already so that we're not encountering these problems over and over.
Look, unfortunately, we'll have to call that one there. I think